In the winter of 1930, an entire Inuit village stood empty, their food still warm, their rifles leaning against door frames, and not a single person left to explain why they ran. The snow held no footprints leading away. The silence was absolute. How does a community of nearly 2,000 people disappear into the Arctic night without a trace? And why did the outside world shrug and move on? The village was called Anjikuni Lake, located in the remote Kivalik region of what is now Nunavut, Canada, roughly 500 miles northwest of Churchill, Manitoba. It was home to a thriving Inuit community that had existed for generations, living off caribou hunting, fishing, and traditional practices passed down through centuries. In November 1930, a trapper named Joe LaBelle claimed he arrived at the settlement to find every soul gone, fires burned down to ash, and kayaks still tied to the shore, as if time had stopped mid-sentence. The story matters now because it sits at the intersection of colonial erasure, sensationalist journalism, and the real, documented displacement of Indigenous peoples across the Canadian North during the early 20th century. What actually happened at Anjikuni Lake has been buried under decades of exaggeration, but the human cost, the unanswered questions about forced relocations, and the pattern of ignoring Indigenous suffering remain urgent and unresolved. The timeline begins with Joe LaBelle, a French-Canadian fur trapper who had worked the Northern Territories for years and knew the seasonal rhythms of Inuit communities. According to his account given to Royal Canadian Mounted Police in December 1930, he arrived at Anjikuni Lake expecting to trade and rest, as he had done many times before. Instead, he found cooking pots abandoned over dead fires, clothing laid out as if people had been interrupted mid-task, and no human presence anywhere in the camp. LaBelle reported his discovery to the RCMP detachment in Churchill on December 3, 1930, according to a Telegraph summary later referenced in northern newspapers. The officer who took his statement, Constable Alfred King, noted the trapper's distress but did not immediately dispatch an investigation team, citing extreme weather and the remoteness of the location. This delay would become a critical gap in the official record. Within 2 weeks, the story reached southern Canada through a sensationalized article published in the Pa Herald, a small Manitoba newspaper known for frontier tales and speculative reporting. The article claimed that nearly 2,000 Inuit had vanished, that graves had been opened and emptied, and that strange lights had been seen in the sky prior to the disappearance. No byline was provided, and no corroborating sources were named. The Pa Herald story was picked up by larger outlets, including the Winnipeg Free Press and eventually the Toronto Star, each version adding new details that cannot be traced to LaBelle's original report. By January 1931, the tale had morphed into a supernatural mystery, complete with sled dogs found starved and frozen in their traces and references to blue lights hovering over the tundra. Meanwhile, official RCMP records from the period show no formal investigation into a mass disappearance at Anjikuni Lake. Archive searches conducted in the 1970s and 1980s by Canadian historians found no incident reports, no follow-up patrols, and no missing persons files corresponding to the alleged event. What does exist is documentation of several government-mandated relocations of Inuit families during the same period, part of a broader policy to centralize Indigenous populations for administrative control. Between 1930 and 1933, the Canadian government relocated hundreds of Inuit families from scattered hunting camps to permanent settlements near trading posts and RCMP stations, often without consent and with minimal regard for traditional land use. These relocations were documented in Department of Indian Affairs records, though many files remain incomplete or were destroyed in later decades. Some historians argue that what LaBelle witnessed may have been the aftermath of one such forced relocation, misunderstood or misreported in the chaos of cultural disruption. No physical evidence of the Anjikuni Lake disappearance has ever been recovered. No archaeological surveys of the site have found mass graves, abandoned artifacts, or signs of sudden exodus. The lake itself exists. The region was inhabited by Inuit groups historically, but the specific event described by LaBelle and amplified by the press has no corroborated foundation in archival or oral history. The primary source for the Anjikuni Lake story is Joe Lebel's verbal report to the RCMP in December 1930, which was never recorded in full detail and exists only as fragmentary references in later newspaper accounts. No transcript of his statement has been located in national or territorial archives. This absence is significant because it means we have no contemporaneous, first-person documentation of what Lebel claimed to have seen. The Pa Herald article from December 1930 is the earliest published account, but the paper did not cite Lebel directly, nor did it identify its sources. Subsequent historians who examined the Herald's archives found no reporter notes or editorial correspondence related to the story. The article's details, especially the claim of opened graves and 2,000 missing people, do not appear in any prior or parallel reports. The RCMP's official stance, clarified in responses to inquiries during the 1940s and 1970s, is that no investigation into a mass disappearance was ever conducted because no credible evidence of such an event was presented. A letter from RCMP headquarters in Ottawa, dated March 12, 1976, states that no records exist of any incident matching the description commonly associated with Anjikuni Lake, and no missing persons reports were filed by indigenous communities in that region during the period in question. Anthropologist and Arctic researcher Farley Mowat investigated the story in the 1950s while compiling oral histories from Inuit elders. He found no collective memory of a village-wide disappearance at Anjikuni Lake, though he did record accounts of forced relocations and the trauma associated with sudden government interventions. Mowat's conclusion, published in his 1959 book, The Desperate People, was that the Anjikuni legend likely emerged from a misunderstanding or embellishment of real displacement events. In the 1980s, Inuit oral history projects conducted by Nunavut Sivaniksavut and the Inuit Taprit Kanatami documented stories of relocation from the 1920s and 1930s, including families who were moved from traditional hunting grounds to permanent settlements with little warning. None of these accounts mention a single event matching the Anjikuni disappearance, but they do describe the experience of returning to abandoned camps and finding belongings left behind in haste. The strange lights component of the story, often cited in paranormal retellings, has no basis in Lebel's original report or any contemporaneous RCMP documentation. The motif appears to have been added by later writers, possibly inspired by other northern light phenomena or by the growing popularity of UFO narratives in mid-20th century media. One perspective, held by some paranormal researchers and popular mystery writers, maintains that Lebel's account is fundamentally accurate and that the lack of official records indicates a cover-up by Canadian authorities. Proponents of this view argue that the government had incentive to suppress information about Indigenous suffering or unexplained events that might complicate colonial narratives. However, no documentary evidence of such a cover-up has been produced, and the theory relies on speculation rather than verifiable facts. A second view, more common among historians and anthropologists, is that the story is a composite myth blending real elements of forced relocation, trapper folklore, and sensationalist journalism. This interpretation suggests that Lebel may have encountered an abandoned camp, perhaps one vacated during a seasonal migration or government-ordered move, and that his report was then distorted through multiple retellings. The absence of corroborating Indigenous testimony from the period supports this reading. A third possibility, raised by some Inuit historians, is that the story reflects the broader erasure of Indigenous experience from official records. Even if no single mass disappearance occurred, the fact that government relocations were poorly documented and that many Inuit voices were excluded from the archive means that Rayal suffering could easily go unrecorded. In this sense, the Anjikuni myth might be metaphorically true, representing countless smaller tragedies that were never properly acknowledged. If a community vanishes but leaves no paper trail, did the government even notice? The gaps are substantial. We have no first-hand testimony from Lebel beyond the fragmented newspaper accounts. We have no archaeological evidence from the site. We have no records of RCMP follow-up, no interviews with nearby Inuit groups conducted at the time, and no documentation of any search effort. What we do have is extensive evidence of forced relocations, cultural disruption, and institutional neglect of Indigenous welfare during the same era. The real human cost of the Anjikuni story lies not in the literal disappearance, which likely never happened as described, but in what it symbolizes about how indigenous people were treated in early 20th century Canada. Families were forcibly separated from their traditional lands, often with no advance warning and no regard for their survival strategies. Children were taken to residential schools, languages were suppressed, and entire communities were uprooted to serve administrative convenience. The forced relocations of the 1930s caused hunger, cultural disintegration, and intergenerational trauma that Inuit communities still reckon with today. Elders who lived through those years describe the experience as a kind of erasure, where their way of life was dismantled so thoroughly that younger generations lost connection to the land and the knowledge embedded in it. The absence of official documentation for many of these events means that grief and loss often went unacknowledged by the state. For the descendants of those relocated families, the Anjikuni legend is frustrating because it overshadows real history with sensationalism. When the story is told as a paranormal mystery, it becomes entertainment rather than a call to reckon with colonial violence. The question is not whether a village vanished in one night, but why so many actual disappearances, displacements, and deaths were met with bureaucratic indifference. Colonial record-keeping was selective by design. Documents were created to serve the interests of the state, not to preserve the experiences of colonized peoples. Think of it like a camera that only points in one direction. The resulting photo tells you what the photographer wanted you to see, but it says nothing about everything outside the frame. For Indigenous communities in Canada, this meant that their movements, their suffering, and even their presence were often invisible to official archives unless it benefited the government to document them. The Anjikuni story also illustrates how myths can obscure history. When a dramatic narrative takes hold, it can crowd out the quieter, more complex truths that require careful listening and research. The tale of a village vanishing overnight is easier to remember than the slow grinding process of relocation, disease, and cultural suppression. But the latter is what actually shaped the lives of thousands of people. From a media literacy perspective, the evolution of the Anjikuni legend shows how stories mutate as they pass through different outlets and audiences. A trapper's confused report becomes a newspaper sensation, which becomes a paranormal staple, which becomes a YouTube mystery, each iteration adding new details that feel true because they've been repeated so many times. Verification becomes nearly impossible once the original signal is buried under layers of embellishment. The broader pattern here is the erasure of Indigenous agency and voice from the historical record. Even when Inuit people tried to resist relocation or document their own experiences, they were often ignored or overruled by authorities who saw them as wards of the state rather than as sovereign peoples with rights and knowledge. The Anjikuni myth is a ghost of that erasure, a story that gestures toward loss but gets the details wrong because the real details were never properly recorded in the first place. Colonial record-keeping was selective by design. Documents were created to serve the interests of the state, not to preserve the experiences of colonized peoples. Think of it like a camera that only points in one direction. The resulting photo tells you what the photographer wanted you to see, but it says nothing about everything outside the frame. For Indigenous communities in Canada, this meant that their movements, their suffering, and even their presence were often invisible to official archives unless it benefited the government to document them. The Anjikuni story also illustrates how myths can obscure history. When a dramatic narrative takes hold, it can crowd out the quieter, more complex truths that require careful listening and research. The tale of a village vanishing overnight is easier to remember than the slow grinding process of relocation, disease, and cultural suppression. But the latter is what actually shaped the lives of thousands of people. From a media literacy perspective, the evolution of the Anjikuni legend shows how stories mutate as they pass through different outlets and audiences. A trapper's confused report becomes a newspaper sensation, which becomes a paranormal staple, which becomes a YouTube mystery, each iteration adding new details that feel true because they've been repeated so many times. Verification becomes nearly impossible once the original signal is buried under layers of embellishment. The broader pattern here is the erasure of Indigenous agency and voice from the historical record. Even when Inuit people tried to resist relocation or document their own experiences, they were often ignored or overruled by authorities who saw them as wards of the state rather than as sovereign peoples with rights and knowledge. The Anjikuni myth is a ghost of that erasure, a story that gestures toward loss but gets the details wrong because the real details were never properly recorded in the first place. Here's what we know for certain. Joe LaBelle reported finding an abandoned Inuit camp in late 1930. Newspapers turned that report into a sensational story about 2,000 people vanishing without a trace. No official investigation was conducted, and no corroborating evidence has ever been found. What we also know is that the Canadian government was forcibly relocating Inuit families during the same period, often with minimal documentation and devastating consequences. What we don't know is what LaBelle actually saw, whether his report was accurate or exaggerated, or how the story grew so far beyond its origins. We don't know if anyone from the affected communities was ever asked about the event, or if their perspectives were simply never recorded. The question now is not whether the Anjikuni disappearance happened, but why the real displacements and suffering of that era remains so much less visible than the myth. In the near term, ongoing efforts to digitize and make accessible historical archives in Canada may uncover new documentation related to forced relocations in the Kivalliq region during the 1930s. This is moderately likely, as archival institutions have been prioritizing Indigenous history projects in recent years. Any new findings could clarify what actually happened in the area where LaBelle claimed to have found the abandoned camp. Inuit-led oral history initiatives may continue to gather testimonies from descendants of relocated families, potentially filling in gaps left by incomplete government records. These projects have been expanding since the 1990s and have already produced valuable insights into the lived experience of displacement. It's highly likely that more stories will be documented, though whether any will directly address the Anjikuni legend is uncertain. The Anjikuni story itself will probably persist in paranormal and mystery media because it has the narrative elements that make for compelling content: isolation, sudden disappearance, and unanswered questions. Debunking efforts have had limited impact on the story's popularity, and it continues to circulate in books, podcasts, and videos. The challenge for creators and audiences is to engage with the story responsibly, acknowledging its fictional or exaggerated elements while pointing toward the real history it obscures. Longer term, there may be formal recognition and reconciliation efforts related to the forced relocations of the 1930s, similar to those that have addressed residential schools and other colonial policies. Such efforts would depend on political will, community advocacy, and sustained public pressure. If they occur, they could reshape how stories like Anjikuni are told, grounding them in documented history rather than speculation. The village that vanished in one night probably never existed, but the communities that were quietly erased by policy and indifference absolutely did. Their stories deserve more than a ghost tale passed around campfires and comment sections. They deserve recognition, documentation, and the kind of attention we reflexively give to mysteries that comfort us with their distance from responsibility. If you're interested in how narratives can be shaped and manipulated for surveillance and control, watch our next video on how a children's cartoon was used to spy on millions, a story where the evidence is concrete and the implications are deeply unsettling.